China and Russia now appear to see North Korea as a strategic asset in their competition with the United States for regional and global influence. Recently, they vetoed a Security Council resolution criticizing Pyongyang for missile tests that violated previous Council resolutions. If, as expected, North Korea conducts a seventh nuclear test, their reactions are likely to be mild and almost surely will not involve support for additional sanctions. China and Russia will continue to pay lip service to the goal of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But in current geostrategic competition with the United States, they are prepared to tolerate a nuclear-armed North Korea that is a thorn in the side of the United States and its allies. For a regime that is notoriously secretive and opaque, North Korea under Kim Jong-un has been rather transparent about its nuclear and missile programs, including ICBMs that can reliably penetrate U.S. missile defenses and strike the American homeland, shorter-range missiles that can threaten South Korea and Japan, tactical nuclear systems that could be used on the battlefield, smaller and lighter nuclear warheads that can be deployed on multiple warhead missiles and battlefield weapons systems. With such capabilities, North Korea hopes it can deter the United States from intervening in a Korean Peninsula conflict on behalf of its South Korean ally. And it hopes it can intimidate Seoul and Washington and prevent them from exploiting their conventional military advantages in any armed conflict on the peninsula. Kim Jong-un has no intention of giving up the DPRK's nuclear deterrent. I think that should be clear by now. He regards his deterrent as essential to the survival of his regime, both to prevent its external adversaries from attacking the regime and to ensure the support and loyalty of key domestic constituents. The so-called legislation, and I say so-called legislation on North Korea's nuclear policies that was adopted by the Supreme People's Assembly 2 weeks ago, contained very little that was new. It was designed to codify and lend an aura of permanence and legitimacy to what Kim Jong-un and other North Koreans had been saying and doing recently. Kim Jong-un said that the new law made North Korea's nuclear program irreversible and non-negotiable. The publicity given to the new law was another step in trying to convince the international community that the goal of complete denuclearization is futile and should be abandoned, and that North Korea should be accepted as a permanent nuclear-armed state. The law also enumerated the circumstances in which North Korea could use nuclear weapons, emphasizing its willingness to use nuclear weapons first, either in response to a non-nuclear attack, or even more worrisome, if it judged that such an attack was imminent. Specifically, it authorized the use of nuclear weapons automatically and immediately in response to, or even in anticipation of an attack on the North's command and control system, meaning Kim Jong-un himself. North Korea's declared willingness to use nuclear weapons preemptively if it fears a decapitation strike is highly destabilizing, increasing the risks of a nuclear conflict resulting from misperceptions or miscalculation. Both the United States and ROK administrations have reaffirmed the goal of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and they've emphasized their readiness to engage in negotiations toward that end. President Yoon proposed his audacious plan to reward North Korea generously for steps toward denuclearization, but the offer was quickly, firmly, and predictably rejected by a regime that values its nuclear deterrent much more than the promise of material well-being. Prospects for engagement with Pyongyang are remote, at least for now. But once North Korea has completed the missile and nuclear tests it believes necessary to achieve its declared milestones, Kim Jong-un may be prepared to engage. It has significant incentives to obtain the sanctions relief that a new agreement could provide. But with China prepared to meet North Korea's minimum economic needs, it isn't desperate to come to the negotiating table for sanctions relief. If the North eventually agrees to negotiate, and that's a big if, it will only be to limit, not eliminate, or to reduce its capabilities. And it can be expected to demand unreasonable compensation, including major sanctions relief, security assurances the allies will find unacceptable, such as the elimination or reduction of U.S. military forces in South Korea, and perhaps even explicit recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. The best that might be expected from such engagement is a limited deal that temporarily bans nuclear and missile tests in exchange for modest sanctions relief. So for the foreseeable future, diplomacy will take a backseat to deterrence in addressing the North Korean threat.
And I'd ask all of you, rhetorically, if you were in what you perceived as a dangerous neighborhood, surrounded by what you perceive are hostile actors, would you give up your trusted shield and treasured sword, which is North Korea's nuclear program? And of course, the answer to that would be no. So from Kim Jong-un's perspective, he must have nuclear weapons in order to survive. Kim Jong-un may actually be very worried because of the alignment of the ROK-US alliance. I think it's clear that the Yoon administration and the Biden administration now have a clear understanding of the nature of the Kim family regime, its objectives, and its strategy. And I think that alignment brings strength to the alliance, and it puts fear into Kim Jong-un, which one of the key objectives of Kim Jong-un and the Kim family regime is to drive a wedge in the ROK-US alliance. That is the key condition for him to achieve his strategic objectives. We should understand that Kim Jong-un is conducting really a strategy of 3 lines of effort. Political warfare, trying to subvert South Korea, subvert the alliance, and subvert the international community. Blackmail diplomacy, the use of increased tensions, threats, and provocations to gain political and economic concessions. The number one being sanctions relief, which he has not received at all since 2017, which has been a key objective. And the third line of effort is, of course, developing advanced warfighting capabilities in order to achieve his ultimate objective, which is to dominate the Korean peninsula under what I like to call the guerrilla dynasty and gulag state of North Korea, in order to ensure the Kim family regime will survive. So that's really its strategy in a nutshell. Now, when we see provocations, Kim Jong-un is trying to leverage those to achieve objectives. And again, the objectives are concessions. And it's imperative that we do not give in to those demands. He is using those provocations also for domestic purposes as well, because it's imperative that he demonstrate there is a threat from the outside, because he must deny the human rights of the Korean people in the North and must justify their sacrifices, the sacrifices they are making so he can develop nuclear weapons. And so provocations feed into that domestic justification for their suffering. And the people are suffering because of the deliberate policy decisions that Kim Jong-un is making. The last thing I will say before I close is that we should not view provocations as a policy failure by the ROK, by the U.S. It's a deliberate policy decision by Kim Jong-un to conduct those provocations. And so we must take those provocations as an opportunity, not a threat. And it's an opportunity to show Kim Jong-un that his strategy will fail. His political warfare, blackmail diplomacy, and warfighting strategy will fail. And we must transmit that message to him and to the Korean people in the North.
The Allies must reinforce their individual and collective defense capabilities to deter the North. Deterrence has to be the top priority. They must demonstrate clearly that North Korea's growing nuclear and missile capabilities will not intimidate them or give them the ability to engage in aggression without facing a resolute and punishing Allied response. Now, this requires a combination of enhanced U.S. and ROK conventional strike capabilities, additional regional and U.S. homeland missile defense systems, greater trilateral defense cooperation between the U.S., ROK, and Japan, and joint allied military exercises of a scope and scale to ensure combat readiness. U.S. officials from the president on down have emphasized that the U.S. commitment to defend South Korea includes the full range of defense capabilities, including nuclear weapons. Washington and Seoul need to consider together how best to strengthen extended deterrence. I don't believe deploying U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea is the answer. It would involve unnecessary vulnerabilities and risks and very high costs. Better solutions are available, such as more frequent and persistent presence of U.S. strategic assets in East Asia, including dual-capable as well as nuclear-armed delivery systems. South Koreans should also be given by the United States a more prominent role in the planning and execution of the American extended deterrent on the Korean Peninsula, including participation in crisis consultations at the most senior level. North Korea says it may use nuclear weapons first in response to or even in anticipation of a non-nuclear attack against its leadership. Now, we don't know whether Kim Jong-un would actually initiate the use of nuclear weapons in a crisis. His threats to use nuclear weapons preemptively may just be intended to make the Allies reluctant to respond effectively, to use force in response to aggressive or provocative DPRK actions. But whether North Korea is serious or just posturing, the United States should reaffirm what it has said in the past, that any use of nuclear weapons by the DPRK would trigger an overwhelming military response that would bring an end to the North Korean regime. At the same time, allies should not speak or act in a way that would reinforce North Korea's paranoia and lead to a North Korean decision to employ nuclear weapons early in a crisis. It makes good sense, in my view, for the allies to have non-nuclear systems able to quickly target North Korean missile launchers and command and control assets in retaliatory strikes. But they should avoid boastful talk about the ability to preemptively decapitate the DPRK leadership, which would feed North Korea's paranoia and increase the risks that it might use nuclear weapons on the basis of misinterpreted information.